Three Ekklēsia Consequences of Augustine. Augustine of Hippo, 354-430, through his prolific works, continues to exercise an influence on Christendom that's hard to overstate. While countless volumes have been written about him and his works without any hint of patronisation, I want in a straightforward, non-academic way to speak to those evangelicals who know little about him, who have never thought about him. I want to draw their attention to three consequences, far-reaching consequences of Augustine to the life of the Ecclesia, consequences which none of us in Christendom can avoid. Originally, I had wanted to use the title, The Ekklēsia Consequences, and so on. But in order to keep this article in bounds, I have limited these consequences to three. But what are three? There's a spectrum of views about Augustine. Many, regarding him as the theologian par excellence and adopting his views, have published their own works developing his doctrines. Roman Catholicism depends heavily on Augustine, but so does the Reformed part of Christendom. Martin Luther was an Augustinian friar, and John Calvin was forever quoting Augustine. Others, however, have considered that Augustine, though he did publish some good material, has a great deal to answer for. I am one such. I've already used two words that need explanation, Ekklēsia and Christendom. Here's a simple definition of each. By Ekklēsia, I mean, as the Greek states, those who are called out of the world, separated from the world, to be united to Christ. These called out ones come together, agree together to submit to the Lord Christ in obedience to his law. They are the children of the new covenant. This is what the New Testament means by the Ekklēsia. By Christendom, I mean that political, religious corporation brought into existence by the shenanigans of the Fathers in cahoots with the Roman emperors Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337, and Theodosius, who ruled from 379 to 395. The tortuous maneuverings of these politicians, writers, teachers, theologians, preachers, and opinion formers produced the monstrosity of Christendom, leading to the unscriptural notions of belonging to a Christian country, state religion, clericalism, priestcraft, sacramentalism and sacerdotalism, infant baptism and infant regeneration, church building, sacred space, church attendance, worship services, and so on. Churchianity and Christendom Christians have been born. Christendom lives and thrives. What an oxymoron to this day. Now for those three consequences I spoke of with regard to Augustine's part in the drastic changes brought about by the move from the scriptural Ecclesia to the Christendom Church. No doubt a serious chicken and egg debate could be held. Did Augustine's work cause the change from Ecclesia to Church, or did he provide the theology needed to bolster those changes? My own view is that while sole responsibility for the changes themselves does not rest with Augustine, even so he is the man who constructed a theology to undergird the various aspects of those changes, and as such he bears a huge responsibility for the resulting damage. 1. Defining those who belong. Augustine taught that the parable of the wheat and tares, Matthew 13, 24-30, 37-43, means that the church is composed of both believers and unbelievers. He was wrong. Christ did not say the field in which the wheat and tares grow is the church. It is the world. The church is a separate body in the world, but called out of the world. Nevertheless, Calvin adopted Augustine's interpretation that the church is mixed believers and unbelievers, and the Reformed churches have followed him. As for non-Reformed evangelicals, de facto an inclusive comprehensiveness is fast becoming the norm. This past 50 years, evangelical opinion formers have been consulting pagans and adopting their aims, principles and practices to attract attenders to church services, hold them, and then coach them into at least a mental assent to truth and some kind of conformity to it in practice. Consequently and overwhelmingly, the church is becoming more and more removed from the ecclesia, increasingly to become a conglomeration made up of some believers and a growing number of Christendom Christians, with a rump of unbelievers. Before long, the number of true believers will be swamped by the sheer weight of numbers of Christendom Christians, not to say rank unbelievers, which they have so strenuously sought to attract. 2. Increase by coercion. Augustine turned to another parable, that of the great banquet, and interpreted, "compel them to come in," Luke 14, verse 23, literally. In other words, he argued that increase in church attendance and conformity should, if necessary, be by coercion. Modern evangelicals have largely dropped the coercion bit, moving from stick to carrot, and using entertainment in the widest sense to attract attenders. I use the word largely and largely dropped coercion. Coercion is not entirely forgotten today. The Reformed who submit to the 1647 Westminster documents still hold to these words: "The civil magistrate hath authority, and it is his duty to take order that unity and peace be preserved in the church, that the truth of God be kept pure and entire, that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed, all corruptions and abuses in worship and discipline prevented or reformed, and all the ordinances of God duly settled, administrated, and observed. For the better effecting whereof he hath power to call synods, to be present at them, and to provide that whatsoever is transacted in them be according to the mind of God." In this, the men of Westminster were following Calvin. God gives us leave to endeavour as much as is possible for us to bring them back again which are out of the way of salvation. Magistrates are armed with the sword to punish those whom God brings to their hands, and to put this doctrine in use. What is more, a considerable number of evangelicals who do not necessarily subscribe to Westminster, while they have dropped Augustine's position on coercion, nevertheless are looking to the state to enforce pagans to conform outwardly to biblical practice. Leaving aside for now the unscriptural, non-New Covenant nature of this, have evangelicals considered what if, which in the UK does not seem to be a remote possibility, the state becomes Islamic? This departure from Scripture, this defection from the New Covenant will come back to bite the Christendom churches. 3. Infant baptism. The New Testament, the New Covenant, is clear. In accordance with Christ's command, all those who trust Christ, and only those who trust Christ, are to be dipped, immersed, plunged in water to symbolize their union to Christ in his death and resurrection, their spiritual death to the old life, the resurrection to the new, and the removal of all their sin in the blood of Christ. Baptism accomplishes none of this, of course, but it does symbolize it. Augustine, by philosophical arguments, worked out a complicated theology to justify the growing practice of infant baptism. His main tenet was that the sprinkling of babies by a professional cleric actually removed original sin. Without it, the infant would be damned. While the Reformed have tweaked Augustine's doctrine, their tortuous covenant theology still preserves the notion of baptismal regeneration. For many Christendom Christians, infant baptism makes the baby a Christian. In addition, many evangelicals who reject infant baptism are growing indifferent to it. As for believers' baptism, it is not unknown for it to degenerate into a rite of passage into adulthood, a sort of social gala with echoes of an American graduation celebration conducted in a party atmosphere. Christendom churches are increasingly tolerant of a range of views on baptism. The upshot. A stark choice is before us. Either we stick with what the last 1600 years of Christendom has produced and continues to develop, or we flee from Babylon, 2 Corinthians 6:14-7:1, Revelation 18:4, and work and look for a measure of recovery of the life of the Ekklēsia. If we take the former route, we will find that Christendom will exact its pound of flesh. If we take the latter route, well, that will take us to the New Testament way of suffering with and for Christ.